Welcome to another edition of the Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. Hello everyone, I'm Alex Turk, and good that you can join us for this episode where we will reflect on the outcomes of COP30, held in the rainforest city of Belém, Brazil, of course. And today we will be exploring how the World Resource Institute Europe, the WRI, is working to accelerate progress on sustainable land use, climate action, and food system transformation. So we're going to shine a light on what COP30 means for Europe, how better data can support implementation, and what is needed to close the gap between ambition and delivery across food and land sectors. And to do this, I'm delighted to be joined today by Stientje van Veldhoven, who is the Vice President and Regional Director for WRI Europe. Stientje, hello and welcome.
Hi, yeah, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, to introduce you, of course, you are a former Minister for the Environment in the Netherlands and have deep knowledge of the circular economy, energy and housing issues, to name a few, and more broadly, European public affairs and policy making and international negotiations. So it would be very good to hear your perspective on the main outcomes of COP30, particularly firsthand, because I know you were there. But first, for listeners who may not know the World Resource Institute well, would you give us a snapshot on your work in food, land and climate?
Yeah, thank you, of course. So, first of all, indeed, for those who might not be known with the work of WRI, World Resources Institute, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary as a global research organization that aims to create solutions to all kinds of environmental challenges. So we want to combat climate change, we want to make sure that nature thrives, and we also want to make sure that people have the opportunity to develop. And so we tackle issues like, of course, climate change, but also the food agenda, forest protection, water, cities, energy, and science, and practical tools. And we are located in 14 countries around the world. And there we work with the local governments, business, and local communities, because we truly believe that being deeply embedded in a country, in a certain geography, also means that you can feel where progress can be made. And so that's why we are located in those countries. And these are mostly the middle income countries, because we feel that if we would be able to help those countries pivot, we stand a good chance as a planet as a whole, as a world as a whole, to actually pivot in the systemic change which is needed. And then, yes, our work on land use and agriculture. I think many people probably sense that the way we use our land and the way we drive agriculture currently is really pushing every planetary boundary, right? Agriculture is already using half of the world's vegetated land. It takes up 70% of our fresh water, drives tropical deforestation, and about a quarter of global emissions. And so as we are seeing that the world's population will change, we also see that demand will change, right? Thinking about by 2050, we might even have 40% of population growth, 55% of higher crop demand, 70% more livestock demand, 50% wood demand more. All in all, right, it could mean that we would expand pasture land and agricultural land, so crop and pasture land, by an area nearly twice the size of India. So at some point, that doesn't fit. So we'll have to become smarter, and so we try to work on solutions that can help us do that.
Yes. Now, I mean, from that sector expertise and your European perspective, how do you view the main outcomes of COP30? I mean, you've so clearly laid out the demands, the needs, the challenges, and some of the stats that back that up. It is, of course, widely acknowledged that this COP did fall short of expectations and actual outcomes. So I wonder, Stientje, can you give us the good news and the bad news?
Yes, of course. So So first of all, it was not my first COP. I think I've been to about 15 COPs in a row now. So, and I think for every COP, we can see that, of course, the needs are very big, and the expectations of what this COP would need to deliver are actually also quite big. And so what I see is that actually every year, right, after the COP, there's always this sense of it hasn't delivered everything that it should have delivered. But I sometimes compare it, and of course and that goes for this COP as well, right? Let me be clear. But I sometimes compare it as well to my trip that I did up Kilimanjaro just over a year ago. And basically, when you go on that long trail and you look up the mountain, you see how far you still have to go, and that seems daunting. And you're wondering if you've made enough progress that day. But then if you turn around and you look backwards, you can also see, let's say, the distance that you've already covered. And so, although at each COP, right, we never achieve as much as the world basically needs us to achieve, because that's the reality, we do really make progress, and every step counts. So, with all I'm going to say about the outcomes of this COP, please do also keep that in mind. It is critical that we have something like a COP where we come together, which creates a deadline for the world to move things forward. And although, of course, it is easy and it's not easy, sorry, it showed, for example, this year again, how difficult it is to confront one of the core issues, the phasing out of fossil fuels, which is, of course, absolutely core, because we can build as many solar panels as we want. But if it does not mean that we're reducing fossil fuels, in the end, emissions don't go down. So we have to come to a phase out. And countries just could not agree here on a clear global roadmap to phase them out. But that's not to say that because of the fact that all the countries couldn't agree, that not a subgroup of these countries did agree. And so while the COP always works with this perfect consensus, that also sometimes covers how many countries are starting to be aligned to make progress. So outside the main negotiation room, I actually found the momentum to be much more encouraging, especially regarding nature. I think it was never as much on the agenda as it was this year, and that is absolutely critical. And I think Belém really made clear that nature and climate and economic stability are one agenda. And so we did also see major steps on forest and adaptation finance. So I think true signs that action is accelerating, even when the negotiations become more difficult. And that's actually also what we see around the world. WRI CEO Anidas Gupta really recently brought out a book about global optimism, basically, and it shows how the transition is underway in many parts of the world. Yeah, even if the negotiations are hard to come to a full consensus agreement. So this COP had much more emphasis on adaptation. There was a new commitment towards adaptation finance. And so I think, and then of course there is the promise of the fossil fuel and deforestation roadmaps launched by Brazil. And I think, of course, the word is still out, right? The jury is still out on of course, how concrete they will become. But if they evolve into credible, inclusive, near global plans, then maybe in a few years we'll say that Belém really laid the groundwork for a more realistic and nature-centered transition. So it's slow steps, but every step counts. And again, I think in Belém, some important steps were taken, but we'll have to continue to work as hard as we can because the issues only get more pressing. Sorry, bit of a long answer, but there's so much to say about Belém.
No, I mean it's so interesting to hear, as you said, sort of outside in the margins and in those conversations, and particularly because you've been to so many of the previous COP meetings, that sense that we often talk about whether we're optimistic or pessimistic on the podcast, and it's good to hear that sense that there is movement. Now I know that WI often stresses the importance of moving faster, so speed, not just ground or mountains covered, but particularly on things like soil health, nature recovery, and reducing agricultural emissions. So in your view, I know you mentioned the adaptation, that look at the triple adaptation finance is on the agenda, but what drivers do you feel will really help Europe shift from these good intentions to implementation?
Well, I think the one thing that we should try to do all together in Europe is to see that basically nature and agriculture and energy and diets, they all connect, and forestry, they all connect to one thing, which is the land that we have available. Right? Somebody said, buy land, they don't make it anymore. And while, of course, that's not intended to be an advice for anybody putting their money somewhere, the truth of it is that we only have a limited amount of land available on this planet, also for Europe. And therefore, we should really be thinking all together, how can we use that land strategically and also then in the context of those strategic choices most efficiently and effectively. And then we should try to make sure that we also steer our policies and our incentives much more coherently towards achieving that strategy. At this point in time, Europe already uses too much land, right? Not many people realize that we rely a lot on land abroad to meet our consumption. If you think in terms of trade deficit, right, in terms of tons of CO2, you could say, of course, we export and we import, right? But annually, we actually have a 400 million ton CO2 deficit. So that's basically land we use that we don't have. And since these numbers are always difficult to actually remember, it's about the same as all the emissions of Australia, Brazil, or Mexico. So that really is big. And it also weakens both resilience and strategic autonomy. And it leads to harmful deforestation. So I think these are the elements that we need to take into account when we think, for example, about our own energy policies. If we import wood from abroad that we then burn for electricity, that creates a land use. And the question is, don't we have better alternatives by now for generating electricities? If we would need less land for our diets, right? Always a difficult topic to discuss. But if we would need a bit less land for diet, because, for example, more people are realizing that maybe already shifting from beef to chicken is also good for your health, then that does mean that we have a lot of land that we don't need for the production for feed anymore. And that would create space for more nature restoration or more combination and more extensive maybe production. So we need to look at our land as a system. We can only use it once. Sometimes you can use it twice. Sometimes you can even use it for 3 purposes, but you have to think that through very carefully. And if we don't start to become more coherent and more strategic in what we use the land for, we're going to keep having this deficit, and that means we're going to keep having a pressure on the rest of the world, and that's going to drive climate change, and that climate change again is impacting our very own ability to produce. And I think we need to acknowledge that there is this cycle. We need to acknowledge that we have a limited amount of land available, and we really have to think through how we can make sure that we use it strategically, but that also it works for the farmers. Because if it doesn't work for the farmer, it will also fail for the world. So we really need to look at this land use from a perspective of both people and climate and nature at the same time. And if we can do that, I think we can still make a big difference.
Yes, thank you. And thinking it through for the farmers, of course, well, in the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, we look at those discussions to look at how Europe has real potential to better align environmental goals with what farmers deliver. But I wonder again, in thinking that through with us, what solutions can help turn that potential into practical progress when you think about stable policies, when you think about financing, as we said, paying for adaptation was very much on the COP30 agenda, and support for rural areas, for example. I know that the World Resources Institute mentioned COP30 in the context of breakthrough in cities. There was some good news on local government commitment and pathway and movement. But on rural areas, I wonder what the view is there, and the support for farmers. Where could intention and solution come there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First of all, I think we really need to start So taking the strategic approach to land use, I already mentioned, in that context, we have to see, so what is so strategic about that land? For example, healthy soils and ecosystems, I don't think we are enough aware of how this is underpinning many of the business cases in Europe. I think the European Central Bank actually recently did a study that showed that more or less 75% of business are dependent on one or more ecosystem services. The fact that we don't see that as an element of our economy that we need to protect better is actually something that we should change, right? Healthy soils and ecosystems really are the hidden backbone, not just of farming, right, but of many other services, and we really need to start taking that into account. I think very specifically, we need to rethink the land use for energy. Nearly half of harvested wood now goes to biofuels and bioenergy, whereas actually you could use those materials much longer than just burning them straight away, keeping them in the loop, making them part of a circular economy. So I think there are many of those policies that we need to make more coherent so that farmers also get a more clear financial framework to make their choices in, and that financial framework should be more connected to basically the ecosystem services that all of our land provides. And that will provide a more stable framework then also for example, young farmers that take over the farm from their parents, right? This transition between one generation and the next is often the moment in time where you make those substantial investments. We need to make sure that we allow farmers to get it right at that point of investment, on the basis of a longer term perspective of also how our climate is going to change, how we adapt to that, but also what is efficient use of that land. And for that, I think we need tools, we need data. Data transparency really is always foundation for real change, right? And if we make sure that we monitor well, if we make sure we have the right tools to give us the transparency about the choice we actually can make, then that also helps us to make the right choice. So I think the connection between the current exciting developments, but also challenging developments on AI, coupled with a more structural assessment of ecosystem services into the decision making, could make a big difference to make sure that the investment we make and the incentives we give are strategically coherent and aligned and can provide also that stability for farmers over the longer term.
Yeah, well, I wanted to talk to you about that data supporting implementation when we look at strategic land use. I mean, both those areas and their crossover, you know, I can tell are very close to the World Resources Institute heart, particularly data and transparency. So, Stientje, I wonder how can better measurement of things like soil carbon, nutrient flows, and biodiversity outcomes, how can that support faster and more credible climate actions in agriculture and really underpin that strategic land use that we've been talking about?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Of course, WRI really is a data organization. We've been so for a long time. For example, people may know the tools like aqueducts or the Global Forest Watch, and we are now even integrating, also again with the help of both satellite and AI, integrating these tools into Nature Watch. And this provides resolutions which are really super interesting. You can kind of see the growth of every tree at some point. So that really becomes a very operational tool then to actually track change. And I do really think that we see data and transparency as the foundation for real change in agriculture. Because, for example, if you take carbon farming, right, if we truly want to reward farmers for storing CO2, we'll have to be able to measure the changes, not just at the global level or the technical level, but really at the field level, to also understand which practices in which content, in which connection or location actually leads to that lasting storage, which is then again important for it to be a carbon credit. Same if you apply to biodiversity and soil health. If you can track soils and vegetation and forests together, then you can show what's working and what is not. And I think the fact that AI and real-time monitoring now make this possible today is actually something which opens a whole lot of new possibilities that were not there before. In Peru, we're seeing that communities with access to deforestation data, for example, were able to support a process that now cuts forest loss by 52%. And that's just by the power of timely and precise information. So here too, I think this better measurement of carbon, soil carbon and nutrient flows and biodiversity makes it possible to develop the incentives more effective so that it also rewards farmers more, right? If you make your farming more sustainable, and the policies will get more credible by it, stimulating, I think, a further development. So that data development will be really key. It turns basically complex systems into practical decisions that farmers and policymakers and people that want to help conserve nature then can actually implement, while taking into account that one place in Europe, right, if you're in Sweden, you'll have a different combination of factors than when you're in Italy. And that is what this real-time monitoring and this granularity will now allow us to do much better than with these overarching rules that, kind of pretend that it's one size fits all, because we all know that in farming and nature conservation, that's not the case.
Yeah. Well, I mean, data development, looking at those, those practical decisions and being able to move the dial is so interesting. And I wonder if I can ask you finally to look at 2026, so the new year just around the corner for us. And when we're looking at what's needed to close the gap between ambition and delivery across food and land sectors, the signs of progress, we've talked about those, but I wonder if you have a new year wish or resolution. What would be the most influential in driving progress?
I would say in one sentence, let's all look across the silos. Because I think that if I see many of the policies that currently have an impact on our land use and on agriculture, we see that there's still too much siloed nature of how these were developed now actually leads to an adding up, which leads to making it all of us more vulnerable at the same time. This stewardship of our land as a whole is becoming really a defining challenge. We see agriculture, forestry, urban development, nature all competing for the same space. Even, it's going to be more difficult since our climate is changing and water cycles are changing. But all of this land is critical, but both for our climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity, but of course, first of all, our food. And our demand for agricultural commodities will not decrease, right, if we see in the world overall due to the global food chain and population change. So my New Year's wish would be, let's all look across the silos. Let's think about the impact that our choice in, for example, the energy domain or in the agricultural domain, what does it mean for the other areas that also need this land, and are we using it efficiently enough? And what can we all do to look across those silos and make sure that the incentives align, that the policies become aligned? And if we can all do that, I think we'll have some complex conversations. But I also think that in the end, we will be able to get to a positive cycle of making better use of our ecosystem services instead of eroding them year by year, step by step, because that in the end is only going to make it more difficult for all of us.
Well, Stientje, thank you so much for your outlook. Thank you for your COP30 insights. Thank you for your own personal Kilimanjaro, and to know that we are looking back and seeing we're making progress and going in the right direction. So we'll say our many thanks again to Stientje van Veldhoven from the World Resources Institute for a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've been listening to another edition of the Food Systems podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. It's been a pleasure having you with us. Please do join us again next time.